The chandeliers at the Hargrove Hotel were the kind that made everyone look expensive. 3,000 crystal drops, each one catching the light and scattering it across the room in a way that flattered cheekbones, softened jawlines, made ordinary people look like they'd always belonged in rooms like this. I had spent 11 years learning how chandeliers like that worked, what flowers to place beneath them, which height of centerpiece would catch their glow without competing for attention. I knew how to make a room feel like a dream. I was very good at that. I was very good at creating beauty that made other people look extraordinary. I was standing at the edge of the main showcase floor, holding a champagne flute I hadn't touched, watching someone else take credit for the dream I'd built. Delilah Arden was talking to a circle of people I'd spent 6 months trying to book. Her dress was ivory silk, her dark hair swept up in a way that looked effortless and cost a fortune to achieve. She had her hand on the arm of Colette Farrow, who was one of the most influential luxury wedding clients in the Northeast, and she was gesturing at my centerpieces, my cascading white garden roses and dried silver honesty and the hand-dipped taper candles, in colors I'd sourced from a small artisan studio in Vermont, and she was describing the vision with the confidence of someone who had thought of it herself. The contrast of the organic and the architectural, Delilah was saying. That's always been my signature, the asymmetry that feels intentional. Colette Farrow was nodding slowly, genuinely impressed, the way people are when they believe they're hearing from the source. My fingers tightened around the champagne flute. I made myself breathe. The display in front of them was pulled directly from a presentation deck I'd emailed to Colette's office 4 months ago. I had the timestamps. I had the original concept sketches in a folder on my laptop at home with metadata that would hold up in any reasonable conversation. Not that it mattered. In rooms like this, credibility wasn't a document you produced. It was a name people already knew. It was the way Delilah stood, like the room had been designed for her. It was the way I stood, like I was still trying to figure out where to put my hands. Across the ballroom, my best friend and studio assistant, Nina Park, was weaving through the crowd toward me. She was wearing a deep wine-red dress and an expression I'd come to recognize as her trying very hard not to say something that gets us band face. She appeared at my elbow. "Colette is looking at your centerpieces," she said quietly, while listening to Delilah explain why she invented the concept of pairing dried botanicals with living flowers. "I know. She didn't invent that." "I know, Nina." "You literally sent Colette a 40-page proposal with your studio name on every page." 4 months ago," I said. "And Delilah got to Colette's assistant 2 months ago. Apparently they had lunch." Nina looked at me with the controlled fury of someone who loved me very much and had watched this pattern repeat too many times. "What are you going to do?" I didn't have an answer. That was the truth of it. I'd been asking myself that question for 3 years, ever since Delilah Arden had appeared in the same space I occupied and started making me feel like a background detail in my own career. I wasn't naive. The event design industry in this city was competitive and expensive and full of people who smiled and stole. But Delilah had an artistry to the way she undermined me that went beyond ordinary rivalry. She studied me. She watched what I was building and she moved on it with the kind of precision that suggested she genuinely believed my ideas became better once they had her name attached. Maybe that was the most insulting part. She wasn't doing it out of desperation. She was doing it because she could. I excused myself from Nina and walked toward the far side of the room, past a towering arrangement of white amaranth and dusty miller that I had installed at 6 a.m, past the long table of crystal and candlelight that represented 4 weeks of my life, toward the corridor that led to the hotel's terrace garden. I needed a moment. I needed air that didn't smell like Delilah's perfume or everyone else's ambition. The terrace was quieter. Small fairy lights were strung between stone pillars, and the night air was cool enough to remind you that autumn was close. I stood at the stone railing and looked out at the city and tried to talk myself down from the particular kind of humiliation that comes not from a single cruelty, but from a slow accumulation of being passed over. I heard footsteps behind me, and I assumed it was Nina. It wasn't Nina. "You're the one who sent Colette Farrow the original proposal." The voice was lower than I expected, composed. The kind of voice that didn't rise in question because it wasn't actually asking. It was stating. I turned around. Evangeline Arden was taller than I'd expected. I'd seen photographs, the kind that appear in foundation donor reports and luxury hospitality trade publications, but photographs hadn't captured the quality of stillness she carried. She was wearing dark green, a structured silk dress with a neckline that was elegant rather than revealing, and her dark hair was down in a way that suggested she'd chosen not to put it up rather than forgotten. She was 35 and looked like someone who had decided at some point in her life that she was done apologizing for being impressive. She was also Delilah's older sister. I straightened instinctively, the way you do when someone walks into a room and the air rearranges itself. "I don't think we've met," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "No," she said, "we haven't." She came to stand a few feet from me at the railing, looking not at the city but at me. "You're Camille Reed. Your studio did the installation tonight." Delilah seems to think otherwise. "My sister often finds that easier." She paused. "You're not going to go back in there and correct her?" It wasn't a question. I felt a flicker of irritation at that. That's a generous assumption about my choices. "It's an observation about the situation," she said. "Going back in there and contradicting my sister in front of Colette Farrow would position you as difficult. The kind of difficult that clients remember as unpleasant rather than principled. You've done this calculation before. That's why you came out here instead." I stared at her. There was something uncomfortably precise about the way she spoke, like she was reading the notes in the margins of a book other people hadn't noticed was there. "Your hands are shaking," she said. I looked down. They were. Barely. I hadn't been aware of it. I curled my fingers around the stone railing. "I'm fine." "You don't have to be," she said, and there was something in her tone then that was different. Not softer exactly. More honest. Like she wasn't offering comfort so much as permission to stop performing. Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. I studied her for a moment. This woman who was supposed to be as cold as her reputation suggested, who was the older sister of the person I most wanted to throw a centerpiece at, who had walked out here and immediately said more accurate things about my situation than anyone had said to me all night. "Why are you out here?" I asked. She turned to look at the city. "I attend these events because the Family Foundation has an interest in the Hargroves charity partnerships. I generally find the first hour palatable and the second hour a reminder of everything I dislike about my industry." "And what do you dislike?" She glanced at me sideways. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not quite, but recognition. "The way talented people are taught to compete for scraps while the people already holding the plate tell them it's an even game." Silence fell between us. Below, the city moved with its ordinary business, indifferent to the ballroom above it. The thing about being humiliated over a long period of time is that it stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like an identity. Standing there on that terrace with Delilah's voice still carrying faintly through the glass, behind us and the weight of another stolen credit sitting in my chest, I felt it arrive. That particular desperation that isn't really recklessness, it's just exhaustion deciding it has nothing left to lose. I looked at Evangeline Arden and said, "I want to propose something." She turned to face me fully. She waited. "I want you to pretend to date me." She didn't laugh. She didn't flinch. She looked at me with the same composed attention she'd brought to everything else, and then she said, "Tell me your reasoning." I hadn't expected that. I'd expected rejection, or at minimum a pause while she decided whether I was serious. Instead, she was asking for my argument. "Delilah has spent 3 years treating me like a minor inconvenience," I said. "She takes my concepts, she undercuts my pitches, she gets to clients through connections I don't have, and she never faces any consequence because she's charming and well-connected, and the alternative to liking her is making an enemy of the entire Arden network." I stopped. If I walk into her world as the woman her older sister chose, that changes the equation. You want social leverage. I want to stop being someone she can erase. Evangeline was quiet for what felt like a long time. She had a way of thinking that was visible without being performative. You could see her actually considering something rather than deciding whether it suited her. "I have conditions," she said. "You're agreeing?" "I'm telling you my conditions before I agree." She turned to face the railing again. "First, You will not treat this as a performance designed purely for my sister's benefit. If we are seen together, we are present together. I don't do convincing halfway. Second, you will tell me when something is wrong. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm reading your body language incorrectly because you're trying to manage how much I know. Third, she paused. This arrangement ends when either of us says it ends. No justification required. I looked at her. Those are more serious conditions than I expected. Most people don't take me seriously until they've heard me out, she said. That's usually their mistake. Why would you agree to this at all? She was quiet again. Then, because I have watched my sister do this to women like you for longer than tonight, and I'm tired of it. She finally looked at me again, and there was something underneath the composure then, something older and more tired. And because you're interesting. You stood in that ballroom for 40 minutes watching someone else claim your work, and you didn't cry, and you didn't make a scene, and you came out here and you proposed a plan. That's not nothing. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. All right, I said, we have a deal. She nodded once. I'll be in touch Monday. We'll start at the Whitmore Gallery opening on Thursday. The Whitmore Gallery opening was the kind of event that Delilah attended because being seen there was professionally important. I knew that. So did Evangeline. I suspected she'd already known about it before I'd proposed a single thing. I went home that night and sat on my studio floor surrounded by order forms and flower buckets and told Nina everything. Nina was quiet for approximately 4 seconds, which was her personal record. Then she said, You asked Delilah Arden's sister to fake date you. Yes. And she said yes. After conditions. What conditions? That we be fully present with each other, that I tell her when something is wrong, that either of us can end it without explanation. Nina stared at me. Camille, those are not fake dating conditions. Those are relationship conditions. It's strategic. It's terrifying, Nina said, and also extremely your type, apparently. I threw a eucalyptus stem at her. The Whitmore Gallery opening was on a Thursday in late September, when the light outside had that particular amber quality that made the city feel like it was in the middle of something important. I wore a dusty rose dress that Nina had insisted on and spent 20 minutes in my studio convincing myself I wasn't nervous. Evangeline arrived at 7. She was wearing charcoal, a long blazer over wide-leg trousers, and she looked like someone who never second-guessed a decision she'd made. She looked at me when I opened my studio door and she said, That color suits you. It was a simple thing. It was the way she said it, without softening it into a question or adding a nervous qualifier, that made it land like something real. We took her car to the gallery. She had a sleek, dark car driven by someone named Thomas, who seemed to understand that his job included not acknowledging conversations in the back seat. The city moved past the windows in wet streaked light because it had started to rain somewhere between my studio and the gallery, and Evangeline sat beside me with exactly the right amount of space between us, and told me, in a low, unhurried voice, which people would be at the gallery and which ones had relationships with the foundation and which ones were likely to report back to Delilah. You've done your research, I said. I always do. Do you do research on everyone you're pretending to date? She turned her head to look at me. I don't make a habit of pretending. I didn't know what to say to that. So I looked out the window at the rain. The gallery was full of the particular hum of people performing interest in art while actually performing interest in each other. Evangeline moved through it with an ease that wasn't arrogance exactly. It was more like she had stopped expecting the world to surprise her and had made a certain peace with that. People turned when she entered, not dramatically, but in the subtle way that important rooms adjust when someone important arrives. And then she put her hand at the small of my back. It was light. It was proper. It would look from any angle like the natural gesture of someone guiding the person they were with. But I felt it everywhere. I felt it in the way my spine straightened and my shoulders settled, and suddenly I was not Camille Reed, who had watched her work get stolen 2 weeks ago. I was Camille Reed, who had arrived with Evangeline Arden, and the room had noticed both of us. Delilah was there. Of course she was. She saw us from across the room, and the expression that crossed her face was small and controlled and absolutely unmistakable if you'd spent 3 years learning to read her. She recovered quickly. She always did. But the recovery itself was information. She noticed. I murmured. She always notices things that affect her, Evangeline said, her voice low near my ear. Try the white wine. The red is too tannic for the space. I laughed before I could stop myself. It surprised me. The laughter surprised Evangeline too, I thought. Something in her face shifted, briefly. She introduced me to 3 people that evening, in ways that made my work sound like something worth paying attention to. Not by talking over me or explaining me to people as if I weren't there, but by saying things like, Camille's studio did the installation at the Hargrove last month. The amaranth display in the East Corridor was hers. And then she stopped talking and let me speak. It was such a small thing. It was such a specific thing. I'd been to so many events where the person beside me, whether a client or a colleague or an occasional date, had either ignored my work or enthusiastically summarized it for me while I stood nodding. Evangeline just handed me the door and stepped aside. By the end of the evening, 2 people had asked for my business card, and one of them was Colette Farrow's interior design consultant. In the car on the way back, I said, "You're better at this than I expected." "At what?" "At making someone feel like they're worth being next to." She looked out her window for a moment. I simply paid attention. "Most people don't bother." "Most people are looking for a reflection," she said quietly. "They want the person beside them to make them feel interesting. I find actual interest considerably more sustainable." I watched the side of her face in the passing streetlight. There was something in the architecture of her that I was beginning to understand was not coldness. It was precision. She didn't give attention casually because she meant it when she gave it. That was the thing about Evangeline Arden. She was dangerous in a way I hadn't anticipated. Over the following 3 weeks, we saw each other 7 times. A hotel industry dinner where I wore emerald green, and Evangeline stayed close enough that 3 separate people asked how long we'd been together. A Sunday afternoon visit to a rooftop garden she was evaluating for a foundation event, where she handed me a branch of late-blooming jasmine without comment and waited to see what I'd do with it. I'd ended up describing exactly how I'd designed the space, and she had listened with the full weight of her attention and later said quietly, "You see structure where other people see empty space." A Tuesday evening, she appeared at my studio at 9 o'clock because we'd agreed she'd accompany me to a late client walkthrough nearby, and she arrived 20 minutes early and I was still sorting stems at my work table, and she sat in my one good chair and watched me work without making it strange. Nina had been there for the first 15 minutes, had looked at Evangeline, looked at me, and announced she had somewhere to be, which was a complete fabrication, but I appreciated it. "You organize by color and weight at the same time," Evangeline said, watching my hands. "It's how my brain works," I said. "If the weight is wrong, the color doesn't matter. The arrangement will collapse. Structure before aesthetics. They're not separate to me." She was quiet. Then, "Most designers I encounter treat beauty as the goal. You treat it as the result." I stopped what I was doing and looked at her. "That's the first time anyone has said that," I said, "like that, out loud." She met my eyes. "It's obvious if you watch for more than 30 seconds. There was a moment then, a beat where the studio was quiet except for the hum of the refrigeration unit where I kept the temperature-sensitive blooms, and the city outside doing its ordinary evening business, and the space between us was charged with something that had nothing to do with strategy. I looked back down at the flowers. Later that night, after the client walked through, after Evangeline dropped me at my door and her car pulled away, I sat on my workbench and said to myself very clearly, "You are in trouble," because I knew what it felt like to be useful to someone. I knew what it felt like to be pretty to someone or convenient or temporary. I did not know what it felt like to have someone sit in my studio on a Tuesday night and watch the way I worked and say something so precisely true that it felt like being found in a room you thought you were alone in. I told Nina the next morning. Nina put down her coffee cup. "You have feelings. I'm managing them. Camille, you described her as a precision instrument of human observation and then said her hands look like a painting. Her hands do look like a painting. You're in love with her. I've known her for 3 weeks. And?" I didn't have an answer for that either. The Arden family dinner happened in week 4. Evangeline had warned me about it on a Wednesday, delivering the information with the kind of calm that suggested she'd thought through how I would receive it before she said it. "My mother hosts a quarterly dinner at the family estate," she said. "Delilah will be there. It would be more suspicious if we weren't seen in that context eventually. You want me to meet your family. I want our arrangement to hold up to scrutiny, she said. The dinner would achieve that, but I am also telling you that it will be uncomfortable and that you can say no. I appreciated that she gave me the option. I also knew that refusing would feel like retreating, and I'd spent 3 years retreating from the Arden family's gravity. I'll go. The estate was north of the city, a stone house that had the particular solidity of old money that had never felt the need to announce itself. Evangeline's mother was a small, elegant woman named Rosalind, who shook my hand with the grip of someone assessing whether I was going to be a problem. There were 8 people at the table, including 2 foundation board members and a cousin who'd flown in from somewhere in Europe, and Delilah. Delilah was gracious in the way that people are gracious when they're calculating the best moment to stop being gracious. She kissed my cheek at the door and said, "Camille, what a surprise," in a tone that suggested it was not remotely a surprise, and that she had spent the last few weeks thinking about exactly this. Dinner was long and beautiful and extremely tense in the way that only family dinners can achieve. Evangeline sat beside me and was, in public, exactly the right amount of present. She refilled my water glass before I reached for it. When a board member asked me, with slightly too much condescension, about the scale of my studio, she said without looking up from her plate, "Camille's last installation was reviewed by 3 national hospitality publications. I'm sure they'd have the scale details if you'd like them." The board member laughed it off. Rosalind watched Evangeline with an expression I couldn't quite read. After dinner, when people had dispersed into the sitting rooms with cognac and conversation, Delilah found me near the French doors that opened to the garden. "I want you to know," she said pleasantly, "that I'm not threatened." "I didn't imagine you were." "My sister has done this before, made these little demonstrations." She smiled. It was a beautiful smile. That was what made her effective. The beauty was real. She gets bored. She always gets bored. "That sounds like a story you need to believe," I said. Something flickered in Delilah's eyes. Not anger, something closer to genuine surprise that I'd said it. I walked away. On the drive back, the city approaching through the rain-spotted windscreen, Evangeline said, "You spoke to Delilah." "She told me you always get bored." A pause. "What did you say?" That it sounded like a story she needed to believe. Evangeline was quiet for a moment, then so quietly I almost missed it. No one usually talks back to her. "She's been counting on that." "Yes." Another pause. "For a long time." I looked at her profile in the passing light. "How long has she been this way?" Evangeline seemed to consider whether to answer. "Since we were young. She's always understood that charm was a currency, and that if she spent it strategically, she rarely had to account for the damage." She paused. "My family has made it easy for her. It's simpler to smooth things over than to confront them." "And you've been smoothing things over?" She turned to look at me briefly. "I've been watching people smooth things over and finding it insufficient." I thought about that for a long time after she dropped me off, about what it costs to be the person in a family who sees clearly and is still expected to maintain the peace, about how that might make a person seem cold when really they were just carrying something very heavy, very quietly. In the following week, something shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens in small moments. The way she texted me at 7 a.m. with a photograph of a flower market she'd passed on her way to a meeting. No caption, just the image. The way I found myself saving that image. The way she started waiting an extra beat after I finished speaking, as if making sure I was actually done before she responded, as if she valued the full sentence rather than just the first half. She noticed I hadn't eaten at the board dinner. She showed up at my studio the next afternoon with a container of soup from a Vietnamese place 3 blocks away. She left it on my work table and said, "You skipped lunch again yesterday." Not a question, just information. Then she stayed for 40 minutes and we talked about nothing in particular, the foundation's latest acquisition, a problematic client I was trying to manage, the way dried pampas grass was reaching saturation point in the design market. It was the most ordinary conversation I'd had in months, and it felt like something I wanted to put in a box and keep. I was, without any reasonable doubt, in serious trouble. The complication came on a Friday. I was at a charity preview, a smaller event at a boutique hotel, and I overheard two women I recognized from the industry talking near the coat check. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was waiting for my jacket, and they were close enough that discretion would have required me to physically move. The Reed woman and Evangeline Arden, one of them said, in the particular tone that people use when they want to sound like they're being sensible. It's obviously a performance. Completely, the other agreed. Evangeline doesn't do relationships, she's too controlled, and why would someone like her choose someone at Camille's level, small studio, no family connections? Camille's using her. It's a strategy, and honestly, Evangeline should know better. I got my jacket. My face was very still. I was very good at making my face very still. I found a quiet corner and I stood there and I let the words do what words like that do, which is confirm every fear you've been talking yourself out of for weeks. Someone at Camille's level. Why would someone like her choose someone like you? It's obviously a performance. It wasn't just about them believing the arrangement was fake. It was the underneath of it, the part that said, even hypothetically, even if it were real, you would not be enough. You would not be the kind of woman Evangeline Arden chose. I'd heard versions of this my whole life, in my family who had not understood why I wanted to design things instead of doing something more practical, and had said so with the gentle certainty of people who love you and still manage to diminish you. In past relationships where I'd been called sensitive and difficult and too much in some moments and not enough in others. In my industry where Delilah had spent 3 years reinforcing the hierarchy in subtle, specific ways. I thought about the fake arrangement. I thought about the fact that Evangeline had agreed to it because she wanted to check Delilah's behavior and because she found me interesting. That was real. What we'd built over the past month, the dinners and the gallery and the soup on my work table and the jasmine branch, that was real too. But whether she wanted me, whether she could want me, in the way I had started to want her, that I couldn't speak to, that was the part I was too scared to examine in proper light. I found Evangeline near the main room talking to a foundation colleague, and I told her I had a headache and was going to leave. I watched her face. She read something in mine that wasn't the headache. She made a brief, polished excuse to her colleague and followed me into the corridor. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing. I'm just tired." Camille. The way she said my name. She had a way of saying my name that removed all the available hiding places. "I overheard something," I said. "It doesn't matter." "It does." She moved closer, not crowding but close enough to speak quietly and be heard. "Tell me." I looked up at her. I was done, in that moment. Done performing ease. "People are saying I'm using you, that you'd never genuinely choose someone at my level, that it's obviously a strategy." Her expression didn't change at first. Then something moved through it, something controlled but real, like weather you can see coming from a long way off. And you believe them. I believe that they're saying what a lot of people are probably thinking. That isn't the same question. I exhaled slowly. "Evangeline, we're pretending." "Are we?" The corridor was quiet. Somewhere behind the closed ballroom doors, someone was making a toast. I could hear the murmur of appreciation that followed. "I don't know what we are," I said honestly. "I thought I did when I proposed this. Now I don't. And I can't keep doing this if every time someone points out the obvious I feel like..." I stopped. "Like what?" "Like I'm a woman who got something she doesn't deserve and is waiting to be found out." She looked at me for a long, still moment. Then she said, "Come with me." She walked toward the end of the corridor, past a service door and around a corner, to a small greenhouse annex the hotel used for their event florals. It was warm inside and green and smelled like wet soil and white hyacinth. There was no one else in there. She faced me. "I need you to hear me clearly," she said, "and I need you not to dismiss what I say as flattery or maneuvering." She paused. "You have spent this entire arrangement waiting for me to reveal that I don't actually see you, that I'm going to do what everyone else has done, which is look at you and see a useful thing rather than a person." She stopped again. "I am not going to do that. Evangeline, you are the most structurally intelligent designer I have encountered in 10 years of working with artists and architects and people who think beauty is a performance instead of a result." Her voice was low and precise and very serious. You choose flowers based on what the room needs, not what will impress clients. You remember what people say weeks after they've said it. You make other people feel significant without erasing yourself. You did it at the gallery, you did it at dinner, you do it constantly and you don't seem to realize it. She paused. What you are not is below my level. What you are is someone who has been told by enough people for enough years that their extraordinary ordinary is less than it is. And I find that... She stopped. A small pause, different from her usual pauses, less controlled. I find that unacceptable. I felt my throat tighten. That sounds like you actually... I couldn't finish the sentence. Yes, she said simply. And then I stopped the distance between us, or she did. I'm not entirely sure who moved first. I think we moved at the same moment, which is perhaps the most honest version of it, which is that neither of us could any longer choose not to. Her hands were on my face, careful and specific and warm, and she kissed me the way someone kisses when they've been thinking about it for longer than they've been admitting to themselves. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not a polite kiss. It was a kiss that held weeks of attention and observation and the particular longing that comes from watching someone and slowly understanding that you want to be the person they come home to. When we pulled back, we were both quiet for a moment. The greenhouse hummed around us with its quiet warmth. That wasn't pretend, I said. No, she said. It wasn't. Her thumbs were still on my cheekbones. I was still holding the lapel of her blazer. Neither of us moved for a beat. I don't know how to do this, I said. Actually, I know how to do the version of this that's strategic and defined and has conditions. So do I, she said. That is the version of relationships I have had access to until now. She paused. I'm suggesting we try a different version. It should have been straightforward after that. Stories like to suggest it becomes simple once the first real kiss happens. It wasn't simple. We were standing in a hotel greenhouse, and one of us was Delilah Arden's older sister, and the other one of us had proposed a fake relationship for revenge, and both of us were people who'd spent a long time learning to protect themselves. Simple was not the first word. But when she took my hand to walk back into the corridor, something in my chest settled, something I hadn't realized was braced. Delilah found out the following week. Not about the kiss specifically, but about the shift in the arrangement. She had a talent for detecting temperature changes in rooms before anyone else noticed them. She called Evangeline, I learned later, and told her that she was making a mistake, that Camille was using her for access, and that the whole thing was a performance. She said Camille had told multiple people the relationship was fake, which was a lie, and that Evangeline was going to embarrass herself when it collapsed. Evangeline told me about it over the phone, her voice calm, telling me not because she wanted me to defend myself, but because she'd decided we'd agreed to no opacity between us. What did you say to her? I asked. I told her that she had confused the kind of woman who performs loyalty with the kind of woman who actually has it. A pause. She hung up. I laughed a little, despite everything. Then, Evangeline, is this causing problems with your family? A careful pause. My mother has opinions. About me? About the optics of a public relationship that emerged during a period of conflict with Delilah. Another pause. She has suggested it would be better for the family's professional relationships if I were to step back. I felt cold. And I told my mother that I appreciated her input. A beat. And that I would not be taking it. I sat down on my workbench. You don't have to make enemies of your family for this. I'm not making enemies. I'm establishing a boundary I should have established years ago. Her voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like resolution. My family has asked me to manage Delilah's consequences for a very long time. I am choosing not to manage this one. There were 3 good weeks, and then there was the night it went wrong. A late foundation event, a charity gala at a downtown hotel, and Delilah had timed her move the way she always timed her moves, precisely in public in front of people who would remember. She stood up during a dinner portion of the evening and gave a gracious toast to the foundation's new hospitality partnerships. And then, in the midst of it, she mentioned Evangeline's recent personal choices, with just enough warmth and just enough ambiguity to make it clear to anyone paying attention that she was performing concern while pointing a spotlight at something she wanted people to scrutinize. She mentioned specifically that the foundation's relationships with certain small design studios might benefit from clarity and due diligence. She did not say my name. She didn't need to. The table shifted the way tables shift when someone says something pointed and everyone decides not to acknowledge it directly. I felt the familiar cold, the familiar calculation of what it would cost to respond, the familiar math of dignity versus strategy. Evangeline started to speak. I touched her arm. Gently, she stopped. I stood up. I had not planned this. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I think, I said, addressing the table with a calm I was manufacturing in real time, that due diligence is an excellent principle for everyone. I smiled, and it was a real smile, not Delilah's kind of beautiful, brutal smile, but something clearer. I'd be happy to share the documentation on any of the projects my studio has contributed to in this industry, the original concept decks, the time-stamped files, the correspondence with clients who'd received proposals before any alternative approaches were presented. I paused. I believe in transparency. I always have. The silence had a texture. Delilah's smile held. Just barely. Evangeline did not stand. She sat very straight and she said, into the quiet, "The Foundation's relationship with Camille Reed's studio is one I have chosen and am proud of, professionally and personally." She didn't look at Delilah. "I'd suggest we return to the toast." People did. The dinner continued. Afterward, in the car, Evangeline looked at me for a long moment. "You didn't need me to speak." "No," I said. "But I was glad you did." "You were glad or you were moved?" I met her eyes. "Both." She reached across and took my hand. It was the first time she'd done that without any public audience to perform for. It was just us and Thomas silently driving and the city going past. "I need to tell you something," she said. I waited. "I agreed to this arrangement initially because I was tired of watching my sister do damage and because I was intrigued by your proposal." She paused. "That is still true. But it stopped being the primary reason somewhere around the Tuesday night in your studio when you explained the difference between weight and color in an arrangement, and I thought, this woman sees the world in a way I have never encountered, and I want to keep being near it. I felt something open in my chest like a flower in Fast Forward, the way you sometimes see in time-lapse videos, that sudden unfurling. I was afraid you were going to choose your family over this," I said, "that the pressure would be too much." "The pressure is significant," she admitted. "My mother is not pleased. Delilah will not forgive it for some time. The board will have opinions for a quarter and then have other things to have opinions about." She looked at me steadily. "None of that changes what this is." "What is this?" I asked. Not a challenge, a genuine question, the kind you ask when you need to hear someone say the thing out loud. "This is me choosing you," she said, "without a strategy, without conditions except the ones that make it honest." And there was the thing I had never been given cleanly, without a catch, just chosen, fully, by someone who didn't look past me toward something more useful. It was the following week that I ended it. Not because I didn't want her, because I finally understood that wanting something real meant I had to be sure I was coming to it whole, not just running toward warmth in the dark. I called her on a Wednesday morning and I said, "I need to step back from the arrangement." A pause. "The arrangement," she repeated, "from all of it, for a little while." My voice held. "I've been running on adrenaline since the Hargrove Gala, and I've been letting Delilah be the reason I get up in the morning instead of my own work. I need to stop letting her be the center of my story, and I need to know that when I come to you, I'm coming as someone who has chosen it, not someone who needed rescue." Silence. "I'm not rescuing you," she said quietly. "I know, that's the point, but I need to know it in my bones." Another long pause. "I'm not going to ask you to stay." "I know." "That doesn't mean I want you to go." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do the work you need to do." It was the right thing to say, and it was also the hardest thing she could have said, because it meant she understood me well enough to let me go. That was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for me, and it was a goodbye. The weeks without her were very quiet. I noticed her absence in small, specific ways. The morning coffee she sometimes sent to the studio, a running joke we'd had about the aesthetic crimes committed by a particular hotel lobby I'd passed on my way to a client. My car felt emptier on the passenger side in a way I'd never noticed before she'd started sitting in it. I found a jacket she'd left on my workbench hook, and I did not move it for 2 weeks. I designed. I went back to the beginning of what had made me love this work. Not the competition, not the positioning, not the war of clients and credits. The moment when an empty room becomes a place where someone's life is marked. I started working on a proposal for a large-scale floral installation for the opening of the Marin Foundation's new gallery space, a commission I'd been offered 6 months ago and had been too nervous to commit to because the scale felt too big, the audience too important. I committed. I spent 4 weeks designing an installation I called Held, because that was the word that kept arriving when I thought about what rooms could do for people. Not impress, not dazzle. Hold. I used dried seed heads and living branches, pale and dark, open and structured, designed to respond to light differently at different points of the day, so that the room was never the same installation twice. It was the most ambitious thing I'd ever proposed in my own name without hedging it, apologizing for it, or scaling it back to seem reasonable. Nina watched me present the final boards to the foundation contact and then took me for noodles afterward and said, "That was the best work you've ever shown anyone." "You say that every time." "No," she said seriously. "I say that work is good. I'm saying this time it was also true." The opening of the gallery installation was scheduled for a Friday evening in November, one of those clear, cold autumn nights where the city feels like it's been pressed clean by the air. I'd been at the space since 6 in the morning. Nina and 2 assistants had helped me get everything in place, and by 4 in the afternoon I was standing in the main room, watching the afternoon light do exactly what I'd calculated it would do to the dried honesty pods near the east windows, catching them silver, making them glow. I felt, for the first time in a long time, completely myself. The event began at 7. People arrived in the way people arrive at foundation openings, in clusters, warmly dressed, ready to be impressed. Several of them stopped in the main room and stayed longer than people usually stay, which is always the best sign. The installation was doing what I'd hoped, not commanding attention but earning it. I was standing near a column of birch branches when I heard the particular quality of quiet that enters a room when Evangeline Arden enters it. She was wearing midnight blue. Her hair was down. She moved through the space the way she always moved, like she knew precisely where she was going and was taking her time getting there because the time itself was not a waste. She stopped when she reached the main room. She stood very still and looked at it. I watched her see it. She took the full room in without rushing it, which was characteristically her, and then her gaze found mine. She crossed the space toward me. "You did this," she said. "Yes." She looked at the room again and then back at me, and something in her face was different. Not the composed attention I was used to. Something more open, more present. Something that looked like being moved. "This is the most honest thing I've seen you make," she said. "It's the first thing I've made for myself in years," I said. "Not for a client, not as competition, just because it was true." She was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" "Better," I said. "Whole, I think." She studied me. "You look it. Evangeline." My voice was steady. I'd thought about this for weeks, what I wanted to say, how I wanted to say it, but now that she was standing in front of me, all the prepared words fell away, and what was left was just the truth. I'm not here as a strategy. I'm not here as a reaction to Delilah. I'm not here because I needed someone powerful on my side. I paused. I'm here because you are the first person who has ever watched me work and known what they were seeing, and that changed something in me that I don't want to go back from. She was very still. "You said," I continued quietly, "that you saw me before I asked you to pretend. I'd been thinking about those words for weeks. She'd said them in the greenhouse, and I'd held them like something fragile. I want you to know that you were the first person I ever let look." She reached out and tucked a strand of dried honesty, one that had fallen from the nearest arrangement, behind my ear. Her fingers were warm against my temple. "I want to be with you," she said, low and clear. "Not as a statement, not as a correction to anything Delilah has done. Because when you walk into a room, you find the places where the light is interesting and you stand in them, and I want to be the person standing beside you." I felt the back of my eyes sting, which I refused to accept, so I tilted my face up to hers instead. "This is the real version," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She kissed me in my own installation in the room I had made with my own hands, in front of the silver-lit honesty pods and the pale birch branches and the people who would later say to colleagues and clients and anyone who'd listen that the most beautiful thing at the Morin Foundation opening had not been the installation, but the moment the designer and Evangeline Arden kissed in the east light, and neither of them looked like they were performing anything at all. Months passed. The installation led to 3 new commissions. Colette Farrow came to my studio in February with 2 assistants and a contract, and said she'd heard consistently good things about my work from a source she trusted, and when I asked who, she mentioned Evangeline Arden almost as an aside, as if it were obvious. Delilah moved on, as people with Delilah's particular talent always eventually do. She found a newer, more useful rivalry and redirected her energy. She and Evangeline arrived at a careful peace that wasn't warmth, but was at least honest, which I privately thought was more than they'd had before. Nina hired 2 new studio assistants, started dating someone she described only as devastatingly competent with a motorcycle, and told me regularly that I looked disgustingly happy and that it suited me. Evangeline was still elegant and still intimidating in professional contexts. She still walked into rooms like she'd decided the room was not going to waste her time. She still spoke in full, considered sentences, and still had the ability to silence a table without raising her voice. At Foundation galas, she was the precise and composed woman that everyone slightly feared and deeply respected, and then she came to my studio. On a Sunday in March, when the light through my studio windows was doing that tentative, hoping for spring thing it does, when I had seed catalogs spread across the work table, and Evangeline arrived with coffee from the place 2 blocks over and sat in my one good chair and read while I worked, occasionally reading a sentence aloud when something amused her, and when I finally looked up an hour later and saw her sitting there, in the afternoon light with her jacket off and her hair slightly displaced and a small, private smile on her mouth that she made no effort to contain, I understood that I had finally built something I was not going to be asked to dismantle. I came around the work table and she looked up from her book, and I reached into the nearest arrangement, the loose rehearsal piece I'd been building for a client's rehearsal dinner, and pulled out a single sprig of white lilac. I tucked it behind her ear. She stilled. Then a slow, genuine warmth moved across her face, rare and specific and entirely for me. "What's this for?" she asked. "Structure before aesthetics," I said. "But sometimes aesthetics are also the structure." She considered that. "That makes no logical sense." "It makes complete sense if you understand flowers." She reached up and adjusted the lilac sprig. "Then explain it to me." Her hand dropped to find mine. "Take as long as you need." Outside, the city went about its March business. Inside, the room held us, warm and still and entirely our own, and I did.